The engine doesn't turn over on the first pull of the throttle, or the second, or the third. But on that fourth crank on a cold Tuesday morning in October of 1987, in a rusted corrugated tin shed on the edge of Harlan County, Nebraska, something happens that nobody in that county expected to happen. Not the men leaning against their pickup trucks at the co-op, not the John Deere dealer on Route 6. And certainly not the banker who had laughed out loud just 6 weeks earlier when an old man named Earl Maddox had walked into First Midwest Agricultural Bank with grease on his hands and said, quietly without theater, that he intended to lead the Harlan County Harvest Parade. The engine coughs once, then twice, then it catches, and that old 40-20 diesel roars to life with a sound like distant thunder rolling across a flat Nebraska sky. And in that moment, something more than a tractor wakes up. Let me take you there. Harlan County, Nebraska, fall of 1987. The Great Plains in October have a way of making a person feel very small and very honest at the same time. The sky out here isn't blue the way it's blue back east. Out here it's enormous, a pale, clean, infinite blue that presses down on the land like a firm hand on a shoulder. The corn has been cut. The fields run golden gray to every horizon, broken only by the occasional cottonwood standing alone at a fence line, its leaves gone copper and trembling in a wind that smells like cold soil and harvest dust and the faint diesel ghost of combines that worked through the night. The town of Alma, the county seat, has about 1,200 people and 3 traffic lights, and a diner called Eunice's where the coffee comes in white ceramic mugs, and nobody asks how you take it because everybody knows. The grain elevator at the south end of Main Street is the tallest structure for 40 miles. The John Deere dealership, Kowalski Implement, sits on Route 6 just outside town behind a chain-link fence lined with gleaming new equipment wearing price tags that could make a grown man weep. This was 1987. The American farm crisis, that slow-motion catastrophe that had been gutting rural communities since the early 1980s, was still very much alive. Land values had collapsed, interest rates had been brutal. Good men, hardworking, decent men whose families had farmed the same ground for 3 and 4 generations, had lost everything to foreclosure notices delivered by polite young men in clean cars from banks in Omaha and Lincoln. The lucky ones had held on by the skin of their teeth, selling equipment, cutting back, planting fewer acres, praying for better prices. This is the world Earl Maddox lived in. And this is the world he refused to surrender to. Let me tell you about Earl Maddox. Earl was 63 years old in the fall of 1987. He stood 5 feet 10 inches in his work boots, though he seemed shorter because of the way he carried himself, slightly forward, slightly hunched, the permanent posture of a man who has spent 40 years leaning into something. His hands were the color and texture of old saddle leather. His face was deeply lined, not from worry exactly, but from weather, from 40 Nebraska summers and 40 Nebraska winters, and the particular squint a man develops when he has spent his whole life reading the sky for what it's going to do next. Earl had been farming the same 320 acres his father had broken sod on in 1921. He grew corn and milo and kept a small herd of black Angus cattle in the north pasture. He was not a wealthy man. He had never been a wealthy man, but until the farm crisis hit, he had been a solvent man, a man whose land was paid for, whose word was good at the co-op, whose Christmas card list included 3 generations of the same neighboring families. The crisis had been unkind to Earl in ways that didn't show on paper. His land was paid for, yes. But his 2 sons had both left, one to Omaha, one to Colorado, and Earl had stayed on alone after his wife Ruth passed from a stroke in the spring of 1983. He farmed his acres with an older hired man named Denny Shapansky who came 3 days a week and didn't say much but worked hard and drank his coffee black just like Earl. The one thing Earl had that nobody quite understood was his relationship with machines. Earl Maddox did not just use equipment, he knew it. He understood diesel engines the way some men understand music, intuitively, deeply, in a way that couldn't be fully explained in words. He had learned from his father, who had learned from the first men who brought gasoline tractors to that part of Nebraska, and he had built on that knowledge every year of his life. He kept handwritten notebooks, spiral-bound, grease-thumbed, filled with torque specs and timing notes and small observations about how a particular engine behaved at altitude, in cold, after sitting idle through a long winter. And in the back of his shed, sitting under a canvas tarp, was a machine that had been sleeping for 15 years. Now let me tell you about Dale Kowalski. Dale Kowalski was 41 years old, the second-generation owner of Kowalski Implement on Route 6, and he was, there's no polite way to put this, the kind of man who confused his own good fortune with personal superiority. His father, Stan Kowalski, had built the dealership from a two-bay shop in the 1950s into the dominant implement dealer in a three-county area. Stan had been a fair man, hard but fair. The farmers in Harlan County had respected Stan Kowalski even when they couldn't afford what he was selling. Dale was different. Dale drove a 1986 Cadillac Fleetwood the color of a Nebraska sunset, a car that stood out in a county where most men drove pickup trucks with dents in the bed and mud on the running boards. He wore pressed Western shirts and a belt buckle the size of a deck of cards. He sponsored the county fair and made sure his name was on the banner. He sat on the board of First Midwest Agricultural Bank, which meant that in the worst years of the farm crisis, Dale Kowalski had a seat at both tables, selling the equipment that farmers borrowed money to buy, and sitting beside the men who decided whether those farmers could keep their land when they couldn't make the payments. Nobody in Harlan County would have said Dale Kowalski was dishonest, but there was a quality in the man, a brightness that came into his eyes when he sensed an advantage, that made older farmers shift their weight and look at the floor when he walked into a room. In the fall of 1987, Dale Kowalski was pushing a new line of John Deere 4955 tractors, big, beautiful machines with 200 horsepower and a cab so quiet you could hear yourself think. The price was $78,500. That was real money in 1987. That was 2 years of good corn at $2.60 a bushel off 300 acres. But Dale had financing arrangements with the bank, and Dale was very good at explaining monthly payments in a way that made the total seem manageable until it wasn't. Dale Kowalski had opinions about old equipment. He shared them freely and loudly at Eunice's diner on Thursday mornings when the coffee crowd gathered. It started, as most things in small towns start, with a conversation that was overheard. The second week of September 1987, Eunice's diner, Thursday morning. The coffee crowd, maybe a dozen men, farmers and merchants, and the county extension agent, a man named Phil Darrett who wore the same Huskers cap every day regardless of season, had gathered at the long table by the window the way they did every week. The talk that morning was about the Harvest Parade, which Harlan County had been holding every October since 1948. It was a real event 4 blocks down Main Street, antique and working equipment, the FFA kids, the 4-H float, the high school band playing something that was recognizable if not quite musical. The parade committee, run that year by a cheerful woman named Lois Hendricks from the county extension office, had decided that the 1987 parade would feature a special lead position for the most restored piece of farm equipment in the county. A plaque would be awarded, a small ceremony. The kind of thing that meant nothing to the outside world and everything to the people inside it. Earl Maddox, sitting 2 stools down from Dale Kowalski at the counter, said quietly, almost to himself, almost to his coffee cup, that he thought he might enter the 40-20. The diner went quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then Dale Kowalski laughed. It wasn't a mean laugh, exactly. It was the laugh of a man who finds something genuinely, fundamentally absurd. It was the kind of laugh that's worse than a mean one because it doesn't even grant you the dignity of being taken seriously enough to be resented. Earl, Dale said, swiveling on his stool, that thing has been sitting in your shed since what, 1972? You couldn't parade a machine like that. You'd need a tow truck to get it down Main Street. A few men smiled, not all of them. Some of the older ones stared into their coffee, but enough. She'll run, Earl said. Earl, Dale set his mug down with the gentle patience of a man explaining something obvious to someone slow. I sell John Deere equipment. I know what those old 40-20s look like after 15 years of sitting. The seals are shot, the injection pump is probably seized. The hydraulics, he shook his head. I'm not trying to be unkind, I'm telling you as somebody who knows these machines. You'd spend more fixing it up than it's worth and you still wouldn't get it running right. I appreciate your concern, Earl said. He left $1.50 on the counter and put on his cap and walked out. Now let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever been in a room when someone was dismissed, not argued with, not challenged, just dismissed, waved away like a bothersome detail? There's a particular silence that follows that, The people who stayed quiet know they stayed quiet, and the person who was dismissed, if they're the right kind of person, they take that silence with them like fuel. Earl Maddox drove home that morning on County Road 14 with the windows down and the October air cold on his face, and he did not say a single word to Denny Shapansky when he pulled into the yard. He just walked to the back shed, lifted the corner of the canvas tarp, and put his hand on the hood of the old green tractor, the way you'd put your hand on the shoulder of someone you hadn't spoken to in a long time. "All right," he said, "let's see what we've still got. Here's what you need to understand about the John Deere 4020. The 4020 was introduced by John Deere in 1963, and it was without much argument one of the greatest tractors ever built in America. It came in row crop, standard, and wheatland configurations. The diesel version produced 91 horsepower at the drawbar, exceptional for its era. It had a synchronized transmission, power shift optional, and a hydraulic system that farmers who used them still talk about the way old pilots talk about certain aircraft. Smooth, responsive, honest. Between 1963 and 1972, John Deere built over 190,000 of them. They went into fields from the Corn Belt to the Great Plains to the river bottom farms of the South. They pulled atro planters and four-bottom plows and grain drills across ground that had never seen a machine that capable. If you wanted to understand American agriculture in the 1960s, you could start with the 4020 and not go far wrong. Earl's 4020 was a 1968 model, the diesel row crop version, serial number beginning with 201R. He had bought it new in February of 1968 for $7,200, which was a considerable sum. He had run it hard through the late 1960s and all of the 1970s. In 1972, he had purchased a newer machine, a 4630, and the 4020 had been moved to backup status, then to light duty, and finally, after a fuel injection issue in the fall of 1972, had been parked in the back of the large equipment shed under a canvas tarp, with the intention of being fixed that winter. Winter passed, then spring, then 15 years. But here is what Dale Kowalski did not know, and what almost nobody in Harlan County knew. Earl Maddox had not simply parked that tractor. Before he put it away, Earl had drained the fuel system completely. He had pulled the injectors and stored them in a sealed metal box filled with light machine oil. He had fogged the cylinders with preservative oil, a technique he had learned from a John Deere service manual dated 1970, and confirmed in conversation with a diesel mechanic in Grand Island whom he had consulted specifically because he suspected the tractor might sit for a while. He had packed the wheel bearings. He had drained and sealed the hydraulic system. He had covered the air intake and exhaust with rubber caps, the kind sold for exactly this purpose but rarely used because most people don't think 15 years ahead. Earl Maddox had, in effect, put that tractor into a kind of agricultural hibernation. And in those 15 years, he had not forgotten about it. He had updated his spiral-bound notebooks with notes on what he intended to do when he brought it back. He had sourced, not bought, just sourced the specific gaskets and seals that would need replacing. He had noted that high-cap manufacturing still produced an overhaul kit for the 4020's new generation diesel. He had, at some point in the early 1980s, attended a one-day John Deere technical clinic in Hastings where a retired John Deere field service engineer named Walt Briggs had talked for 6 hours about 4020 fuel system service. And Earl had sat in the front row and taken 11 pages of notes in his cramped, precise handwriting. Now let me ask you something else. What does it mean to know something, not to have read about it, not to have watched someone else do it, but to have that thing inside you, the timing, the feel, the sound that tells you when it's right and when it isn't? Earl Maddox knew diesel engines the way a musician knows pitch. And over the next 8 weeks, working mornings and evenings in a shed lit by 2 drop lights hanging from the rafters, with Denny Shapansky occasionally handing him tools or holding a flashlight without being asked, he was going to prove it. The work began the 3rd week of September. Earl started with the fuel system, because that was where the machine had last spoken and refused to continue. He pulled the injection pump, a Rusamaster DB series, the type that had given some owners fits but that Earl had worked on twice before on other machines. He disassembled it at his workbench with the kind of methodical care that is almost meditative to watch. He cleaned each component in a parts washing basin he'd had since 1961. He inspected each piece against the specs in his notebook. He ordered 3 small parts from a diesel injection supplier in Lincoln, total cost $23.40, and they arrived in 4 days. The injectors came out of their oil bath in perfect condition. The seals were intact. Earl cleaned each one, tested the spray pattern with a hand-operated tester he'd borrowed from his neighbor's brother-in-law who ran a small diesel shop in Republican City, and found that 4 of the 6 needed recalibration. He did it himself at the workbench in the evenings after supper, wearing reading glasses he'd bought at the pharmacy for $4.99. Meanwhile, he addressed the engine. The fogging oil had done its work. When he pulled a head bolt and checked the cylinder walls with a bore light, they looked, by Earl's accounting, cleaner than many engines half the age. There was a small amount of surface oxidation on one cylinder wall, but nothing that concerned him. He replaced the head gaskets anyway because he was doing this right. He replaced the valve cover gasket. He replaced every external seal that showed age. The electrical system, which on a 1968 4020 was a relatively simple 12-volt setup, needed new wiring at the starter circuit and a new battery, obviously. Earl sourced the battery from the Napa Auto Parts in Alma. For the wiring, he spent 2 evenings tracing circuits against a wiring diagram he'd obtained by writing a letter to the John Deere Historical Archive Service in Moline, Illinois, who sent him a photocopy by mail within a week. The hydraulics were clean. The preserved fluid he drained out after 15 years was, by his judgment, still within specification. He refilled the system with fresh hydraulic fluid and cycled the 3-point hitch up and down until the movement was smooth. The tires, 2 large rear duals and the front steerable pair, were shot. He knew they would be. He drove to a farm tire recapper in Red Cloud who had a set of used rear duals in the right size, 18.434 for $240. The fronts were in better shape and cleaned up adequately. The body. This was where Earl Maddox surprised Denny Shepansky, who had said very little throughout the entire project but who had watched everything with the attention of a man storing away knowledge. Earl stripped the old paint down to bare metal using a combination of a wire wheel on an angle grinder, borrowed from Phil Darrow at the extension office, and a chemical stripper he applied with a brush in long, careful strokes. The original John Deere highway yellow and green had faded and crazed, and in places had lifted off in sheets, revealing the gray primer beneath. Under the primer, the metal was remarkably clean. No rot, no serious corrosion. The careful storage had paid off. Earl painted the tractor himself in the shed, using a spray gun he had owned since 1974. He mixed the paint to match the John Deere color codes, highway yellow, John Deere green, using specifications he had, of course, written down in a notebook. He applied 3 coats, sanding between each. He painted the sheet metal, the frame, the wheel centers. He masked the decals, original decals that had survived under the old paint and were still legible, with blue painter's tape. He polished the chrome on the exhaust stack. He replaced the seat with a new upholstered cushion ordered from a tractor parts catalog, cost $31. He painted the front cast iron weights, 4 of them, 98 pounds each, the correct shade of gray. By the second week of October, the machine in that shed bore almost no resemblance to what had been parked there 15 years before. And then came the Tuesday morning. October 13th, 1987. Cold. The thermometer on the shed wall read 31 degrees. Earl had driven up to Alma the day before and entered the tractor officially in the Harlan County Harvest Parade, specifically in the category of most completely restored working equipment. Lois Hendricks, who ran the parade committee, had looked at the entry form and then up at Earl and said, "Is this the tractor I heard about?" Dale Kowalski said. "I know what Dale Kowalski said," Earl replied, not unkindly. "I'd appreciate it if you just kept the entry." She did. Now it was the Tuesday before the Saturday parade. Earl needed to hear the engine run. He primed the fuel system. He checked the throttle linkage. He checked the glow plugs, new ones, all 6 installed the previous week. He climbed up into the seat, that new seat firm and smelling of fresh upholstery, and he sat for a moment, hands in his lap, looking at the instrument panel he had cleaned and polished until every gauge was readable and the glass was clear. Then he engaged the starter. The first crank, nothing. The fuel system was still breathing. The second, a cough, a deep diesel cough that rattled through the shed and startled a cat that had been sleeping on a shelf. The third, the same. The fourth crank, the engine caught. It stuttered, rolled, found itself, and then it ran, not smoothly at first. It blew a small cloud of white smoke that rolled toward the open shed door and into the cold October morning. The RPMs fluctuated. Earl held the throttle steady, not hurrying it, not forcing it, just holding it at a low idle and listening. He listened for 4 minutes. The white smoke thinned, the idle smoothed. The valvetrain settled into its rhythm, that particular mechanical, alive sound that anyone who has ever known a well-tuned diesel engine will recognize instantly. A sound like a very precise clock made of iron and combustion. Earl reached down and moved the throttle up slowly to working RPM. The tractor responded without hesitation. Denny Shepansky, who was standing in the shed doorway with a cup of coffee, said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "Well." Earl climbed down, walked around the tractor once, checked for leaks, there were none, and shut the engine down. Then he did something Denny would later describe to his family as the only time in 30 years of knowing Earl Maddox that he had seen the man come close to showing emotion in front of another person. Earl put both hands flat on the hood of that freshly painted 4020, bowed his head, and stood like that for about 10 seconds. Then he straightened up, picked up a rag, wiped a smudge off the exhaust stack, and said, "We'll run her again Friday morning before the parade. Make sure she stays warm overnight." Saturday, October 17, 1987, Harvest Parade Day. Alma, Nebraska, Main Street. The crowd was modest by city standards, maybe 400 people lining the sidewalks, sitting on tailgates, children perched on their fathers' shoulders, paper cups of hot cider. The high school band in the parking lot of the hardware store, warming up with a version of On Wisconsin that had nothing to do with Wisconsin, but was the one song the trumpet section had more or less mastered. The equipment lined up behind the grain elevator on 3rd Street. There were 7 entries in the restoration class. A 1955 Farmall 400, beautifully done, owned by the H. Harbeck family. A 1961 Oliver 880, white as a cloud, belonging to a retired farmer named Gerhardt who had driven it from his place 12 miles south of town under its own power. 2 older Ford 8NS. A Minneapolis Moline that drew admiring looks from anyone old enough to remember them. And at the front of the line, because Earl had arrived first at 7 in the morning with 2 hours to spare, the 1968 John Deere 4020. Dale Kowalski was there, of course he was there. He was on the Harvest Parade Committee and he was standing near the judging table with Lois Hendricks and 2 other committee members. He had his Cadillac parked up the street. He was wearing his best Western shirt, blue with white piping, and his boots were shined. He saw the 4020 before most people did. He walked toward it the way a person walks toward something they aren't entirely sure they're seeing correctly, slowly, with their heads slightly tilted. He walked all the way around it, twice. He crouched down and looked at the wheel centers. He stood up and looked at the hood. He read the serial number plate. He did not say anything. Lois Hendricks came over, clipboard in hand, and she did say something quietly to Dale, and those standing nearby said that Dale's response was a single word, said after a pause that lasted several seconds. "Yeah." The parade started at 10. The 4020 led the equipment line. Earl drove it sitting upright in that new seat, hands on the wheel, looking forward down all 4 blocks of Main Street in Alma, Nebraska, at a pace that let every person on every sidewalk see the machine clearly. The engine ran without a stumble. The exhaust stack stood straight and chromium bright in the October sun. The freshly painted green and yellow caught the light at every angle. The front weights gleamed gray and purposeful. Let me pause here. Because here is what a photograph cannot capture about that moment, and what I want you to understand. The silence. Not silence exactly. There was the band, there were children calling out, there were the sounds of the other engines behind. But among the older men on those sidewalks, the men who had farmed this county for 30 and 40 years, the men who had watched their neighbors lose their land, the men who had tightened their belts and prayed and kept going, among those men there was a quality of attention as the 4020 passed that was not quite applause and not quite silence, but something between them. A recognition. An acknowledgement. Several of them removed their hats. One man, a retired farmer named August Vanderhoof, who was 81 years old and had not been well enough to stand for the whole parade, rose from his lawn chair and stood. The 4020 won the Restoration Award unanimously. Word traveled the way word travels in small counties, not on television or radio, but mouth to mouth, coffee cup to coffee cup, telephone call to telephone call. By Monday morning, something had happened that had not happened in Harlan County for several years. People were talking about something good. The Hastings Tribune ran a small story, not front page, but inside with a photograph about the Harlan County Harvest Parade and the restored 4020. The photo wasn't spectacular, but the caption named Earl Maddox and included the detail about the 15 years in storage. Someone from the State Fair Agricultural Heritage Program called Lois Hendricks. She gave them Earl's number. Earl was invited to display the 4020 at the Nebraska State Fair Heritage Agriculture exhibit the following summer. He went, driving the tractor the 9 miles to the fairgrounds on a borrowed trailer behind Denny's pickup, and the tractor drew the kind of sustained attention at the fair that newer equipment never quite gets. People asked questions. Older people touched it reverently. Children climbed up and had their pictures taken in the seat, and Earl, who was not by nature a man who enjoyed crowds, found that he was willing to stand beside that machine for hours, answering questions without impatience. He was interviewed by a gentleman from a publication called Nebraska Farm Bureau News, and the piece they ran, about 3 months later, included enough of what Earl said about diesel preservation and storage technique that the Nebraska Department of Agriculture's Small Farms Division requested permission to reprint it in their bulletin. Earl gave permission. He did not request payment. The broader ripple was quieter but, in a way, more significant. In the year following the parade, Earl was asked 3 times by 3 different farmers in the area to consult on old equipment they had in storage or had acquired cheaply and wanted to restore or return to service. He charged nothing for the first 2. For the third, a more complex job involving a 1964 Oliver 1800 with a damaged injection system, he accepted $150 and the man's word that he would pay it forward somehow. He later heard that the Oliver farmer had helped a neighbor diagnose an electrical problem on a vintage tractor the following spring, free of charge. The chain of competence passed hand to hand. Dale Kowalski's behavior in the years that followed changed in a way that was almost imperceptible to people who didn't know him but was quite clear to people who did. He stopped holding court at Eunice's on Thursday mornings. Not immediately, gradually. He still came in, still drank his coffee, still talked equipment. But the particular quality of certainty in his voice, that reflexive dismissiveness toward anything that didn't come out of a current model year catalog, was less pronounced. Some people attributed it to aging, some people attributed it to the farm crisis humbling everyone. A few people who had been in the diner the morning Earl Maddox said the 4020 would run attributed it to something else. Earl Maddox did not sell the 4020 after the parade. He ran it, light duty, disking a field in spring, pulling a scraper blade on the lane. The machine did its work without complaint. He kept up with its maintenance with the same care he always had, adding notes to his spiral-bound notebooks as the seasons passed. In the summer of 1989, Earl's son Michael drove up from Omaha with his wife and his 2 boys, ages 9 and 12. Michael had been away from farming for 6 years, working in logistics, and his relationship with his father's world had the slightly strained quality of a man who has left a place he is not entirely sure he was right to leave. But on the second day of the visit, the 2 boys wanted to see the tractor they had heard about from their father, who had heard about it from Denny Shapansky, who had called him the week after the parade to tell him about it. Earl took them to the shed. The boys climbed on. Earl started the engine, and the older boy, Danny, 12, who would later become an agricultural engineer at the University of Nebraska, put his hand on the hood and felt the vibration traveling through the steel and said, with the unguarded directness of a child who has not yet learned to hide what he finds interesting, "How does it do that?" Earl looked at his grandson. He handed the boy his notebook, the current one, the one with the most recent entries. "Read that," he said. "Start at the beginning." Danny did. It took him most of the afternoon. He still has the notebook. Or rather, he has a photocopy of it. The original is under glass at the Harlan County Historical Society, donated by Earl's family in 1994, the year Earl passed quietly in the farmhouse where he had been born at the age of 70 with his sons on either side. The 4020 is still on the property. Michael's son Danny, the agricultural engineer, now in his late 40s, has it at his place outside Lincoln. He runs it occasionally. He says it starts on the 4th crank or sometimes the 3rd. He keeps the notebooks. Let me close with this. There is a kind of knowledge that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come in a new vehicle, and it doesn't wear pressed shirts, and it doesn't sit on bank boards. It wears old work clothes, and it sits in the back of sheds under canvas tarps, and to the casual eye, to the eye that has learned to measure worth by surface and novelty and price tag, it looks like nothing worth taking seriously. But it was there when everything was new. It was there when the first machines broke open the first ground. It learned from the failures and the fixes and the long cold mornings when something wouldn't start and there was nobody to call. It wrote things down. It paid attention when there was nothing immediate to gain from paying attention. It preserved what others threw away, not out of stubbornness, but out of respect for the thing itself, for the intelligence embedded in its design, for the people who built it. Earl Maddox was not a famous man. He left no great fortune. He gave no speeches. He never sought recognition for what he knew. But in a county where the farm crisis had stripped many things down to their essence, stripped away the pretense, the easy credit, the idea that new was always better, Earl represented something that people recognized at a gut level, even if they couldn't have named it precisely. He represented the difference between owning something and knowing something. Dale Kowalski owned John Deere equipment. He knew the price of it. He knew the financing terms and the horsepower ratings and the trade-in values. This is a form of knowledge, and it is not without value. But Earl Maddox knew what happened inside an engine when the fuel met the compression and the timing was right. He knew what a diesel sounded like when it was well, and what it sounded like when something was wrong in a way it might be possible to fix. He knew how to put something away properly so it could come back. He knew, in short, not just what things were worth, but what things were. There's a long tradition of that kind of knowledge in American farming. It goes back to the men who first had to fix what broke because there was no one else to fix it and no money to replace it. It was passed down in sheds and fields and at workbenches, father to son, neighbor to neighbor, often wordlessly, passed through the hands more than through speech. That tradition was threatened in the 1980s, and it has been threatened since by the perfectly understandable logic of complexity and specialization, and the idea that knowledge is something you subscribe to rather than something you earn. Modern machines are remarkable. The men and women who service them professionally are skilled and deserving of respect. I mean no disrespect to them. But there is still something irreplaceable about the person who understands the thing in front of them, not just how to run it, but why it works and what it needs and how to bring it back. That person is worth listening to, even when their hands are greasy, even when they're sitting at the counter at Eunice's, talking quietly into their coffee cup, especially when someone laughs. Because sometimes the quiet one is counting on you to laugh. Sometimes the quiet one has been waiting 15 years, keeping notes, preserving what was worth preserving, and all they need is for you to tell them it can't be done. The fourth crank. That's all it takes. Just the fourth crank. Historical context is real. The John Deere 4020, produced 1963-1972, is widely regarded as one of the greatest tractors in American agricultural history. The Nebraska farm crisis of the 1980s was a genuine and devastating economic event that reshaped rural communities across the Great Plains. The Rusamaster injection pump and the preservation techniques described are historically accurate. Characters, names, dialogue, and specific events are dramatized for storytelling purposes. The Harlan County Harvest Parade is fictional but reflects a real tradition of community harvest celebrations across the American Midwest.